one of the, I think, really interesting parts of Phil Petrie's paper that you're reading this week is how he directly spoke to his experience with his wife, and how his being raised thinking that the only appropriate emotion for men to exhibit was being quote unquote cool, which really means exhibiting no emotions, how that hurt him and his relationship with his wife, but how it also, he sort of hints that it, manifested in his sexual relationships with women, in that he might have been more sexually aggressive, in that was seen as the only permissible outlet for him to show emotion. And, I think for anyone who's studied or knows anything about sexual assault, this is very often the case, right? That sort of violence against someone else, whoever the victim of that assault might be, right, tends to be a representation of some psychological or emotional issue on the part of the assailant, right? That they must not have an outlet in other areas of their life to explore or to solve whatever issues they're having. And so this is seen as the only quote unquote acceptable way for them to show their dominance or make themselves feel better about whatever it is, right? And as we'll also see discussed very greatly, and as I'm sure you already know, asserting one's masculinity in this type of hegemonic model typically means, right, a notion of being homophobic, right? So being very much threatened by any other type of masculinity that at all embraces femininity. And that was seen as something that homosexual men did. Again, that is a false stereotype. But, right, even if that were the case, the question is, why would another man, possibly embracing his femininity, be a threat to someone else's sense of gender identity, right? It typically, I think, would instead invoke the opposite, that it must be a sign that they're not comfortable or confident in their own masculinity if they're so easily threatened, right, by how someone else manifests their gender or sexual identity, right? So the solution here is to give us a more technical term instead of multiple masculinities, is to talk about the word intersectionality, right? So looking at how not just the hegemonic model has privileged a certain type of man, but when breaking away from that model, we not only need to look at all of those different elements, right? Race, class, ableism, socioeconomic status, right? Religious identity, sexual, right? All of those things, but we also need to look at how they overlap with one another, right? And so feminism is going to do a lot of work to explore the intersectionality of these different systems of discrimination and oppression, right? Similarly with how different aspects of our identity might coalesce or intermingle to create unique types of opportunity and privilege, right? So intersectionality works both ways. The idea is we're trying to get a more robust sense of the ways in which all facets of our identity come together to create a much more dynamic, right, as in changing and comprehensive conception of who we are and what that means for our place in the world, right? And so what's very important here is that since masculinity is going to be just as important a component to explore as femininity, that men can do a lot to help change the hegemonic system, right? Because one, change is already happening, so it seems pretty impractical to cling to something old and outdated, right? Just an unwillingness to change. Also because, again, many men actually suffer under the existing hegemonic system. And so it actually is in most men's interest to help combat this, instead of simply trying to work their way up the hierarchy, which I think is a false sort of optimism that the people in power have convincingly conveyed to people, right? That, oh, you don't want to change the existing power structure, you just someday want to be at the top of it, right? So you should help us maintain that system so that one day you can benefit from it. The idea is that you're never going to benefit from it if you're not already benefiting from it. And so to be suffering under that and to maintain it is to really maintain the system that is oppressing you. And so the goal is to see that everyone or many people can benefit, right, from overturning that system. And also, right, even if you do happen to be somewhat privileged under the system, you probably care about people who are not privileged by the system. And so if you care about them in the ways that you think you do, or if you care about them enough, then you should want to work towards their equality, even if that comes at the expense of some of your own privilege. And so I'm just going to give you a quick personal example. When I got hired in my full-time position at Green River as a tenure track instructor, there was a man who is in a group of philosophers in Washington State who was very upset that he did not get even an interview at Green River. And he sort of implied that I only got hired because I was an adjunct at Green River previously, right? So I did get an interview, which, right, seems reasonable. But of course also that I only got it because I was a woman, right? That because women are underrepresented in philosophy, that they gave me special treatment in this sense. And so he asked me, well, what if there was a black woman who was up for the position? Would you have been happy if they got the position over you? And I said, absolutely, right? I would be happy to have lost out on the job that I got to someone who would be more representative of the diversity that we need, right?